The story changed on the third telling, not dramatically, not in the way that amateur liars change stories wholesale, obviously, with the panicked wholesale revision of someone who has forgotten what they said before. It changed in the way that the most dangerous inconsistencies always change. In a single word, in the substitution of one small detail for another, in the replacement of a preposition that nobody would notice unless they were the kind of person who notices everything. Poirot was that kind of person. He had been listening to Geoffrey Alderton tell the story of his wife's death for the third time in 40 minutes, and the third time Geoffrey said, "I heard her fall from the landing," instead of what he had said twice before, "I heard her fall on the landing," and the difference between "from" and "on," in the context of a woman found dead at the base of a staircase, was not a small difference at all. On the landing suggested she had fallen while she was on the landing. From the landing suggested she had fallen while she was above the landing, which suggested a different staircase, a different height, a different physics of the fall. Or it suggested a man who had told the truth twice and made a slip the third time. Or it suggested a man who had lied twice and accidentally told the truth the third time. Poirot sat in the drawing room of Alderton Hall in the Hertfordshire countryside on a damp November afternoon and looked at Geoffrey Alderton with the pleasant, attentive expression of a man who is listening and noted, in the grey cells, the substitution of a preposition and said nothing about it. Not yet. He had not been brought to Alderton Hall to investigate a death. He had been brought by Geoffrey Alderton's solicitor, a cautious and intelligent man named Francis Dray, who had telephoned Whitehaven Mansions 3 days after the inquest with the specific hesitancy of a professional who suspects something and cannot prove it to look at a situation. Dray's words on the telephone had been careful. "There are aspects of Mrs. Alderton's death that the inquest did not fully resolve. The verdict was accidental death. I am not satisfied that the full picture was available to the coroner. I would consider it a great service if you could spend some time at the house." Poirot had come. He had spent the morning walking the house and the afternoon sitting with Geoffrey Alderton, asking questions with the unhurried, apparently casual interest of a man who is simply being courteous to a bereaved widower, asking him to describe the evening, to tell him what happened, to walk through it again from the beginning. And Geoffrey Alderton, 49, tall and lean, with the particular quality of a man who has been handsome and has aged into something more compressed, had told the story 3 times. And on the third telling, he had said from instead of on. "Mr. Alderton," Poirot said, settling his fingertips together. "One small thing. When you say you heard your wife fall, where were you at that moment, precisely?" Geoffrey looked at him. "I was in the bedroom, our bedroom, on the first floor. And the staircase, the main staircase, is audible from the bedroom? If the door is open, yes. Our door was open. And the sound you heard, was it one sound or several?" A fractional pause. One sound. A thud. Not the sound of footsteps first? Not the sound of someone moving on the upper landing before the fall? No, just the one sound. And after the sound, how long before you went to the landing to look? Immediately. Seconds. Poirot nodded pleasantly. "Thank you." He looked around the drawing room, the good furniture, the well-chosen pictures, the flowers that had been placed with the slight mechanical care of someone performing domestic normalcy rather than feeling it. "You have lived here how long?" 19 years, Geoffrey said. "We moved here when we married." "And Mrs. Alderton Vera, was she familiar with the staircase? Comfortable on it?" "She had lived here for 19 years, Geoffrey said. "She walked those stairs every day." "Yes," Poirot said. "That is what I thought." He stood. "You have been very patient, Mr. Alderton. I wonder if I might see the upper floor tomorrow morning." "In the daylight." "Of course," Geoffrey said. Poirot went upstairs to the guest room that had been prepared for him and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, thinking about staircases and the physics of falling and the difference between 2 prepositions that most people would never notice. Then he thought about Francis Dray's words on the telephone. The full picture was not available to the coroner, and he thought, no, it was not. In the morning, before Poirot went to look at the staircase, he went to look at Vera Alderton. Not the woman. The woman was 4 weeks dead, buried in the churchyard of St. Bartholomew's in the village of Alderton Green, her grave still fresh mounded, its flowers still resolving themselves into the tidiness of established grief. He went to look at what Vera Alderton had left behind. Her rooms first. The upper sitting room that had been hers, the room at the end of the corridor on the first floor, overlooking the east garden, where she had, according to the household's understanding, spent her evenings reading and corresponding and doing the things that a woman does in the private space of her own household, when she has been given one room to be entirely herself. It was a room that told a story, not a dramatic story, nothing so obvious, but the story of a woman who had been, in her domestic life, someone of considerable organization and care. The bookshelves were in precise order, not alphabetical, but by subject and then by a logic of use, the most consulted books most accessible, the less used higher and further. The writing desk was cleared of all active correspondence, which was expected since she was dead, and her correspondence would have been managed by the household. But the desk's interior drawers, when Poirot opened them with the unself-conscious directness of a man who has not asked permission and has not been told he cannot, revealed the further story. She had kept records of everything. Financial records, household accounts, kept in a hand that was precise and small, with the clarity of someone who tracked every pound, and had been doing so long enough that the tracking was habitual rather than anxious. Letters in folders sorted by correspondent, her sister, her friends, her solicitor, and a category of letters that Poirot examined with particular attention. The category labelled in her small hand simply with an initial, R. The letters in the R folder were from a woman named Ruth Cavendish. Poirot read 3 of them, reading other people's correspondence, with the equanimity of a man who has learned that the living keep their truths in drawers and the dead cannot object. They were warm letters, warm in the specific way of a long female friendship, full of reference and private language, and the shorthand of people who have known each other for decades. But running through the warmth, in the most recent letters, the last 2 dated within 3 months of Vera's death, was a thread of something else, not alarm, more precise than alarm, a specific concern about a specific thing. In the second-to-last letter, Ruth had written, "I know you think I am worrying unnecessarily. I know you think the situation is manageable. But Vera, you have always been too generous in your assessments of people and too slow to recognize when that generosity is being exploited. Please speak to Francis Drey about the Marchmont shares. At the very least, have him look at the documents. I am not comfortable with how this has been arranged." In the last letter, dated 6 weeks before Vera's death, you said you were going to speak to Geoffrey about it directly. Did you? What did he say? Please write soon. I am more worried than I want to be. Poirot replaced the letters in their folder. He went to look at the staircase. Alderton Hall's main staircase was the kind of staircase that a certain category of English country house considers its architectural statement wide, carpeted in a deep burgundy runner secured by brass stair rods, with a polished mahogany banister running from the ground floor to the first floor landing, and then continuing, more narrowly, to the second floor above. The first floor landing was broad and well lit by a window facing east. The second floor landing reached by the narrower upper flight was darker, with a single window on the north face that in November admitted little light. Vera Alderton had been found at the base of the main staircase on the ground floor, at the foot of the stairs, in the narrow space between the last tread and the hall floor. Geoffrey had said she had fallen on the landing, and then he had said she had fallen from the landing. Poirot stood on the first floor landing and looked down. A fall from this landing, in the conventional sense a loss of balance at the top of the lower flight, would have sent a person down the carpeted stairs, landing at the base of that flight. It would have been a serious fall. The stair rods were brass. The carpet, though thick, covered stone steps beneath. But a fall from the second floor landing would have been different. The upper flight opened to the first floor landing, and from that point a person could, depending on the geometry of the fall, have gone over the banister rather than down the carpeted upper flight. Poirot looked at the banister. At the point where the upper flight joined the first-floor landing, the banister rail was a different height from the rest, the joining piece. Old and slightly different in its dimensions from the rest of the rail. He examined it with his glass. And on the inner face of the rail, at the precise height where a person's center of gravity would be if they were leaning or being pushed over it, there was a mark, not a mark in the wood, a mark on the brass fitting that capped the newel post at the stairs turning, a slight compression in the metal, a denting of the decorative cap, consistent with significant pressure applied from above. Consistent with someone gripping the rail tightly, desperately, the grip of a person trying not to go over and not being able to maintain it. Poirot photographed this in his mind with the precision of a man who has no camera but does not need one. Then he went to the second floor. The second-floor corridor was largely unused guest rooms, a linen cupboard, a room that had been a nursery and was now simply a room that contained what rooms contain when they have been emptied of their purpose but not of their contents. At the end of the corridor, overlooking the south garden, was one room that was not dusty, not unused, not in the passive state of the rest. It was a study, not Geoffrey's study. Geoffrey's study was on the ground floor. Poirot had been shown it yesterday. This was a room that had been someone else's workspace. A desk with a computer incongruous in this Edwardian house, the modernity of it almost startling, and beside the computer a printer, and beside the printer a series of box files, and on the desk, left with the slight disorder of recent and interrupted use, 3 documents. Poirot read the documents. 2 were printouts, financial documents, share purchase agreements, the specific formal language of commercial transactions. The company name was Marchmont. The shares were in Vera Alderton's name. The purchase price was substantial, not ruinous, but substantial, a sum that represented a significant portion of what Poirot assessed, from what he had seen of the household records, was Vera's personal financial reserves rather than the joint estate. The third document was handwritten, not a letter, a list. Vera's small, precise hand, headed simply, Questions for G. The questions read, 1. When were the Marchmont shares actually purchased? The dates on the certificates do not align with my bank records. 2. Who signed the transfer authority? I did not sign a transfer authority for this amount. 3. What is the current trading position of Marchmont, and why is this not documented in the prospectus Francis showed me? 4. Why has R spoken to you twice in the last month without telling me? The fourth question had been underlined, twice. R. Ruth Cavendish, the friend who had written the letters in the folder, the friend who had urged Vera to speak to her solicitor, the friend who had written what, did he say? 6 weeks before Vera fell down a staircase, she had walked every day for 19 years. And Ruth Cavendish had spoken to Geoffrey Alderton twice in the month before Vera's death, without Vera's knowledge. Poirot stood in the second-floor study in the November light and looked at the list of questions that Vera had been preparing to ask her husband, questions she had never asked, or more precisely, questions she may have asked, on the night that she died, at the top of a staircase that connected the second-floor study to the first-floor landing, in a house where her husband was awake and listening. The solicitor arrived at Alderton Hall at 11, at Poirot's request, a request made by telephone the previous evening, before Geoffrey's hearing. In the careful language of professional consultation, I would value your presence tomorrow morning, Dre. There are aspects of the financial picture I need to understand. Francis Dre was 55, a lean, careful man with the specific professional precision of a solicitor who has built his practice on the understanding that the details other people overlook are invariably the details that matter. He had a thin face and watchful eyes, and the manner of someone who has spent his career in the management of other people's most important decisions and has learned, through long experience, that the most important decision is always the one being avoided. He had been Vera Alderton's solicitor, her personal solicitor, the solicitor she had appointed herself rather than the one Geoffrey used for the estate. This distinction was significant. It told Poirot that Vera had understood, at some point in her marriage, the importance of having separate professional representation. They spoke in Vera's upper sitting room, which Dre accepted as the appropriate location with the slight quality of a man coming to a place he has been thinking about. "The Marchmont shares," Poirot said. Dre looked at him. "You found the documents?" "In the second-floor study, along with Vera's list of questions." He paused. "You knew about the Marchmont investment." "Vera consulted me about it 3 months before she died. She brought me the certificates and asked me to advise on them. She was not suspicious, precisely. She was uncertain. The investment had been made on her behalf, she was told, by Geoffrey, using her personal reserves. She had not given specific authorization. Geoffrey had power of attorney for their joint financial management, but Vera's personal account was outside the scope of the power of attorney. Specifically outside it, at her instruction, when the power of attorney was drawn up. So the use of Vera's personal funds for the Marchmont investment was not authorized. It was not authorized under the terms of the power of attorney. Dre paused. Geoffrey's explanation, when I raised it with him formally, was that Vera had given verbal authorization, that the investment had been discussed and agreed, that the documentation was a procedural oversight. Another pause. Vera told me she had given no such authorization. She told me she had not been consulted. 2 incompatible accounts, Poirot said. Yes. I was in the process of investigating further when Vera died. He looked at the window. The inquest found accidental death. I could not, at that point, bring an unresolved financial dispute to bear on a coroner's hearing about a fall down a staircase. The two things were there was no established connection. But you suspected one. Dre was quiet for a long moment. I suspected that a woman who had recently discovered a potentially fraudulent use of her personal funds and who had prepared a list of direct questions to put to her husband had died before she could put them. I found that timing troubling. He looked at Poirot. I could not take that to the police. I had no evidence of anything except a financial irregularity and a woman's death that the coroner found accidental. But I could take it to you. The Marchmont shares, Poirot said. What is Marchmont? A development company. Property. Geoffrey has interests in several property ventures. This is his business. Alderton Developments. Marchmont was a subsidiary vehicle for a specific project. A housing development on the edge of Alderton Green, which the village has been fighting for 2 years and which is currently subject to a planning appeal. And if the planning appeal succeeds, the Marchmont shares become very valuable. The land involved has been held at cost for 3 years. The development value, if planning is granted, would multiply the investment substantially. He paused. If planning is refused, Marchmont is essentially worthless. And Vera's personal funds invested in Marchmont without her authorization were a substantial stake, approximately 40% of her personal reserves. If the planning appeal fails, she loses that money. And if it succeeds, Poirot said. Dre looked at him with the specific expression of a solicitor who has arrived at a conclusion he does not like. If it succeeds, and Vera is alive, the gain accrues to her personal estate. She becomes significantly wealthier, and the unauthorized investment becomes, retroactively, a sound one that she might choose not to challenge. He paused. If it succeeds and Vera is dead, her personal estate, including the Marchmont shares at their now valuable rate, passes to Geoffrey as her widower under the terms of her will. Poirot was very still. He invested her money in his own venture, Poirot said, without her authorization. And then, when she found out and began asking questions, he stood to gain everything if she died before the planning appeal resolved. That is the picture as I understand it, Dre said quietly. But it is a picture without a frame, Monsieur Poirot. A financial motive and a dead woman and a convenient staircase does not constitute evidence of murder. The coroner found accidental death. Without something more, there is something more, Poirot said. Several things more. but I need to speak to Ruth Cavendish first. Ruth Cavendish lived in a flat in St. Anne. John's Wood, a generous, comfortable flat that reflected the life of a woman of independent means and independent mind, full of books and music, and the collected evidence of a life lived with specific and well-considered tastes. She was 52, with the kind of face that becomes more interesting as it ages: strong features, dark eyes, the precise directness of someone who has always said what she thought and has not, over time, found reason to change this approach. She had been Vera Alderton's closest friend since university. 30 years of friendship, the kind that becomes structural, that holds a person's life together in ways they don't always articulate because they don't need to, because the friendship is simply there, as the load-bearing walls of a house are simply there, invisible until something tests them. Vera's death had tested it. Ruth Cavendish was, when Poirot arrived, a woman in the specific condition of grief, compounded by guilt, the grief of losing the most important friendship of her adult life, compounded by the guilt of someone who believes they could have done something and did not do enough. "I knew something was wrong," she said, before Poirot had asked his first question. "I knew it for months. I wrote to Vera. I know she kept the letters. She kept everything I told her: to speak to Francis Drey, to speak to a financial advisor, to confront Jeffrey directly. I was too." She stopped. "I was too respectful of her marriage. I kept saying, speak to him, when what I should have done was drive to Hertfordshire and sit in that house and make sure that conversation happened while I was there to witness it." "You spoke to Jeffrey," Poirot said. "Twice. In the month before Vera's death, without telling her." Ruth looked at him with the sharp eyes of someone caught in something they have been waiting to be caught in. "How do you know that?" "Vera's notes. She knew you had spoken to him. She had written it as one of her questions for him. Why had you spoken to him without telling her? What were those conversations?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. "I rang Jeffrey," she said. "The first time 6 weeks before Vera died, I rang him because I was frightened. I had read the letters Vera sent me. I had understood what was happening with the money, and I thought if I spoke to him directly, told him that I knew, that Vera's friends were paying attention, that he would stop, pull back, find a way to resolve the financial situation quietly." She paused. He was very smooth about it, very controlled. He said I had misunderstood the investment structure. He said Vera was fully informed. He said the documentation would clarify everything, and he would make sure Vera sent me a summary. And the second call? 2 weeks later, because no summary came, and Vera's letters were becoming the last letter she wrote me. She sounded frightened. Not of anything specific, but the quality of her writing changed. She had always written with a kind of with confidence, with the assurance of someone who is settled in their life. The last letter was different, smaller, somehow, as though she were writing in less space than usual. She looked at Poirot. "I rang Jeffrey the second time, and I told him directly that I thought something was wrong, and that if Vera didn't ring me within the week, I was going to come to the house." His response? He was less smooth that time. There was something, a quality in his voice that I had not heard before. Very controlled, but underneath it, she stopped. "I told Vera in my last letter that I had spoken to him. I asked her what he had said when she confronted him. She never wrote back, because she died 3 weeks later." Ruth's hands, in her lap, closed. "Mr. Drey telephoned me the morning after they found her," she said. "He told me the circumstances. He told me what the coroner was likely to find." She looked up at Poirot. "I was on the telephone to him for 40 minutes, and at the end of it, we both knew what we thought had happened, and neither of us could say it, and neither of us could prove it." She paused. "And then Francis told me he was going to call you. What do you know about the night Vera died?" Poirot said. Ruth looked at the window. "She rang me that afternoon," she said, "the day she died, at 4:30. She rang me, and she said she had found the documents, the Marchmont certificates, the purchase records, the evidence that the money had moved from her personal account without her specific authorization. She said she had been up to the second floor study the room where Jeffrey kept his business files, and she had found everything laid out, not hidden, just filed there, accessible, as though Jeffrey had simply not thought it necessary to conceal it, because why would she ever look? And she was going to confront him that evening. That evening, yes. Jeffrey was due back from London at 7. She said she had her list of questions and she was going to ask them over dinner, and she wanted answers before the night was out. Ruth's voice was very steady. She said she wasn't afraid. She said that more than once. "I'm not afraid of him, Ruth. I just want the truth." A pause. She sounded certain, prepared, the way she sounded before a difficult meeting when she was still working, organized and calm, and not going to be deflected. And she never rang again after that. She never rang again, Ruth said. And the next morning, Francis telephoned. There was a third person who needed to be found. Poirot had understood this from the moment he read Vera's list of questions. "Why has R spoken to you twice in the last month without telling me?" Ruth Cavendish. Yes, that was the obvious reading. But Vera had labeled her friend's letters R in the folder in her desk. She had used the initial consistently for Ruth Cavendish. And yet the fourth question used R, as though it referred to someone else, someone whose connection to Jeffrey was separate from Ruth's friendship with Vera, someone who had been in contact with Jeffrey independently, without Vera's knowledge, not Ruth, or not only Ruth. Poirot went through Vera's correspondence folder a second time, more carefully. He had identified the letters labeled R as Ruth's. But there was a second set of documents in the folder, not letters, but receipts and invoices. In a section Vera had labeled R.A.C., which Poirot now opened. Restaurant receipts. 3 of them, spanning 2 months. The same restaurant each time, a French place in Mayfair, expensive, the kind where the receipts were discreetly printed on heavy paper. The receipts were for 2 people. The dates were Tuesday evenings. And the name on the receipts, the booking name, was not Jeffrey Alderton. It was Rosalind Fenn. Poirot looked at the name for a long moment. He went back downstairs and found Jeffrey in the garden, or found Jeffrey, where he had been standing for most of that morning, on the terrace, looking at the south garden with the slightly abstracted quality of a man performing the role of the grieving widower, with the slightly unconvincing effort of someone whose attention is elsewhere. "Mr. Alderton," Poirot said pleasantly. "I wonder if you could tell me about Rosalind Fenn." Jeffrey turned. His face performed surprise cleanly, without overemphasis, and then something else moved through it that was quicker and less controlled, before being replaced by the settled professional composure he presented to the world. "Rosalind is a colleague," he said, "a development consultant. She works with the Marchmont project. And you have dinner with her on Tuesday evenings at a French restaurant in Mayfair." A fractional pause. "Occasionally. Business dinners. Business dinners that Vera was aware of. I don't itemize my business schedule to my wife, to my—" "Bucker," he stopped, corrected himself. "I didn't itemize my schedule. But Vera knew about Rosalind," Poirot said. "She had kept the receipts, your receipts, presumably, which she found somewhere in your papers, and she had filed them in a folder labeled with the initial R." He looked at Jeffrey steadily. "Was she aware that Rosalind Fenn was involved in the Marchmont investment? That the company Vera's personal funds had been moved into was connected to a woman you were having dinner with on Tuesday evenings?" Jeffrey looked at him with the eyes of a man making a calculation. "Rosalind is a business colleague," he said again. The composure was holding, but it was holding the way a wall holds, when the pressure behind it is building, not cracked, but audible. "I would like to speak to her," Poirot said. "Today, if possible." "I don't see why." "Because I am investigating the circumstances of your wife's death," Poirot said, with the same pleasant tone he had used throughout. The tone that did not change whether he was asking about the weather or asking about murder. "And Rosalind Fenn appears to be connected to the financial matter that Vera had identified as important in the days before she died. And in my experience, the people connected to the financial matter are the people who can illuminate the fuller picture. He paused. Unless you have a reason why I should not speak to her. Geoffrey Alderton looked at him for a long moment. I'll give you her number, he said. Rosalind Fenn was 41 years old, and she was, from the first moment Poirot saw her, a person of considerable and carefully managed force. She came to Alderton Hall at 5 o'clock. She had driven from London, which meant Geoffrey had told her to come, and she had come, which meant their relationship was one in which Geoffrey's instructions were followed, which told Poirot something specific about the character of the arrangement. She was tall, dark-haired, with the physical assurance of someone who has learned to present themselves as an asset in professional environments and has been succeeding at this for long enough that the performance has become almost natural. She was dressed in the specific way of a woman who has thought carefully about what impression she is making and has made it appear effortless, a good coat, simple jewelry, nothing excessive. She shook Poirot's hand with a direct, firm grip. She sat in the drawing-room chair with the settled ease of someone who is not uncomfortable in this house. And this told Poirot, before she had said a word, that she had been here before, possibly often. He asked about Marchmont. She answered with the fluent precision of a professional, describing a project she knew well, the development site, the planning application, the appeal, the financial structure of the vehicle. She was good at this. She gave him the shape of the project without excess. He asked about the Marchmont shares held in Vera Alderton's name, a fractional change not in her expression, in the quality of her attention, like a shift in current in still water. Vera's investment in Marchmont was Geoffrey's decision, she said. He identified it as a strong opportunity for her personal portfolio, without her specific authorization. That's a question of documentation. Geoffrey had general authority. Geoffrey's power of attorney covered the joint estate. Vera's personal account was explicitly outside it. He looked at her pleasantly. This is not in dispute. Francis Drey has confirmed the scope of the power of attorney. The question is why Vera's personal funds were used for a Marchmont investment that she did not explicitly authorize. He paused. And the answer, which I believe you know, is that Vera's stake was necessary for the project's capitalization at a critical point. Marchmont needed additional investment to proceed to the planning appeal stage. The investment from Vera's personal account filled that gap. And Geoffrey could access those funds because he managed the household's financial administration, and Vera trusted him. Rosalind Fenn looked at him. Her composure was excellent, not quite as excellent as she thought. I am a development consultant, she said. The financial structure of Marchmont is Geoffrey's responsibility. You are, also, Poirot said, the beneficial owner of 17% of Marchmont's equity through a holding structure registered in Jersey. He watched her. I had this confirmed this morning. You are not simply a consultant on the project. You have a financial interest in its success. Which means that the additional capital from Vera's personal account, which kept the project viable, benefited you directly. The room was quiet. Geoffrey told me the investment was authorized, she said, very carefully. Perhaps he did, Poirot said. And perhaps you believed him. That is for you and your lawyer to determine. What I am interested in is a different question. He sat forward slightly. On the night Vera Alderton died, you telephoned Geoffrey at this house. The telephone records show a call at 9:15, approximately 2 hours after Geoffrey says he heard Vera fall. Approximately the time at which, if the fall had just occurred, a man in a state of distress would be telephoning the emergency services and his neighbors and his family. Instead, he telephoned you. Rosalind Fenn was very still. That call, Poirot said. What was said in it? She said nothing. The call lasted 11 minutes, Poirot said. Not the call of a man telephoning to say there has been an accident. The call of two people having a conversation. He looked at her with the full attention of the grey cells. What was said, Madame Fenn? She looked at the window, at the November garden outside, at the dark yew hedge along the south border, and the bare rose beds, and the long lawn going grey in the late afternoon light. He rang me, she said, very quietly. He said it was done. Those were his words. he said. "It is done." She paused. I knew what he meant. I had known for weeks. I had known that the situation with Vera was building to something. He had told me she had found the documents. He had told me she was preparing questions. He had told me... She stopped. "He had told you he was going to resolve the situation," Poirot said. "Not in those words. He never said it in those words. He said he was going to manage it, that it would be sorted, that by the time of the planning appeal there would be no difficulty with the Vera situation." She was looking at her hands now. I told myself it meant a conversation, a financial settlement, perhaps a separation. I told myself it was a business problem being solved by business means. She looked up at Poirot. I did not let myself think the other thing. I did not let myself think it because thinking it would have made me responsible. And when he said it is done, I knew. When he said it, I knew what it meant. I knew what had happened. She closed her eyes briefly, and I said nothing. I said something neutral, something that acknowledged the call without acknowledging what the words meant. And I rang off. And I sat in my flat in London for 4 weeks telling myself I did not know, telling myself I had not understood, telling myself the inquest had found accidental death and that was the end of it. She looked at Poirot. "But you knew," he said. "Yes," she said. I knew. The reconstruction was Poirot's assembled, from the physical evidence, the financial record, the testimonies of Dre, Ruth, and Rosalind Fenn, and from the grey cells that had been working on it since the moment Geoffrey Alderton said from instead of on the third telling of a story. Vera had come home from her afternoon call with Ruth, had organised her documents, had prepared her questions, and had waited for Geoffrey. He had arrived from London at 7 as expected. They had eaten dinner. The housekeeper, who did not sleep in the house, had left a prepared meal in the kitchen and departed at 6. The house was empty, except for the two of them. The dinner had been, in Poirot's reconstruction, the time of the confrontation. Vera had put her questions. Geoffrey had been faced with a choice between the truth and a performance of innocence that, given the documentary evidence Vera had assembled, was no longer viable. What the conversation had produced, what combination of revelation and threat and counter-threat, was not reconstructible from evidence. Only Geoffrey knew. Only Geoffrey would ever know, since the other person who knew was dead. What was reconstructible was the sequence that followed. Vera had gone upstairs, not to bed, to the second-floor study where her documents were, perhaps to retrieve something, perhaps because the conversation had ended and she needed to be away from him, perhaps because she had told him she was going to call Francis Dre and was going to her desk to do it. She had reached the second floor. She had gone to the study. She had or had been about to make a decision about what came next, and Geoffrey had followed her. The mark on the newel post cap at the first-floor landing junction, the compression mark, the evidence of desperate grip, told the story of a person who had gone over the banister rather than down the carpeted stairs. A person who had fallen from above the first-floor landing, caught briefly on the rail, and gone over. From the landing, not on it. The fall would have been from a height of approximately 12 feet to the stone floor below the carpet in the hallway. Fatal, or very close to it. The death had been attributed to the head injury sustained in the fall. The coroner had found it consistent with a fall from the upper staircase, consistent with, not incompatible with being pushed. Geoffrey's story, the single thud, the immediate response, the finding of Vera at the base of the stairs, was a story constructed around the minimum of detail required. No account of the argument at dinner. No account of following her upstairs. No account of a second person at the top of the staircase when Vera fell from it. And then the telephone call to Rosalind Fenn at 9:15. It is done. Jap had been in London, following the financial thread, when Poirot telephoned him at 5:30 on the second evening. Poirot told him what he had, the preposition, the mark on the newel post, Rosalind Fenn's testimony. The financial structure of Marchmont and the unauthorized use of Vera's funds, the phone call at 9:15. Ruth Cavendish's account of Vera's prepared confrontation. Japp listened without interrupting. When Poirot finished, there was a silence on the line that had the quality of a man assembling and testing a structure. "Rosalind Fenn will testify?" he said. "She has already said more than she intended to," Poirot said. "Whether she will testify formally depends on what she is offered and what she understands her own liability to be. She has a financial interest in Marchmont that benefited from the unauthorized investment. But her direct involvement in the death, I believe she is telling the truth that she was not informed in advance, and that she understood the call at 9:15 as confirmation of something she had chosen not to think about, rather than advance knowledge. Chosen not to think about is not the same as innocent. No, but it is different from complicit. Her lawyer will make that argument, and it is not an unreasonable one." He paused. "The physical evidence at the staircase, the mark on the Newell post cap, needs to be examined by your forensic people. It is not conclusive alone, but in combination with the phone call, the financial motive, and Fenn's testimony, it's enough to arrest and charge," Japp said. "Whether it's enough to convict is what the court decides." Another pause. "The phone call alone, it is done, 2 hours after the death, before the police were even called, that is powerful. He did not call the police for an hour after Vera fell," Poirot said. "He told the coroner he was in a state of shock, that he checked on Vera and understood she was dead, and sat in the house for an hour unable to act. An hour in which he called Rosalind Fenn and spoke to her for 11 minutes. "I'll drive up tonight," Japp said. The arrest of Geoffrey Alderton was made at Alderton Hall at 8:30 on a November evening, in the drawing room of the house he had lived in for 19 years, where his wife's absence was present in every surface and every arrangement, and every flower in every vase that had been placed, with the slight mechanical care of a man maintaining the appearance of a household from which the person who had made it a home was gone. Geoffrey said nothing when Japp read the charge. He looked at Poirot once, a single, level look that was not asking a question, because it already knew the answer, and then he looked away and said nothing more. Poirot visited Ruth Cavendish in St. John's Wood the following morning. He brought her the news himself, which was a specific choice he could have let Japp or Dre or the impersonal machinery of official communication deliver it. He chose to come himself because Ruth Cavendish had been at the beginning of this, in the worried letters in a folder labeled R, and she deserved to hear the end of it from the person who had followed the thread she had started pulling. She opened the door and saw his face and said nothing. She led him into the sitting room with its books and its music and its evidence of a carefully and specifically lived life. She made tea not because either of them particularly wanted it, but because the making of it gave the arrival of news the right amount of space. Then she sat down and looked at him. He told her. She was quiet for a long time after he finished. She held her cup and did not drink from it, and looked at something on the middle distance between Poirot and the window. "I should have gone to the house," she said. "When she didn't ring back after my last letter, when a week went by and I hadn't heard. I said I would go to the house if she didn't ring within the week, and then I waited another few days. I told myself she was busy, that she was managing the situation, that she would ring when she was ready." She paused. "I waited 3 days too long." "You could not have known," Poirot said. "I knew something was wrong. I had known for months. Knowing something is wrong and acting on it as though it might be as wrong as it actually is, those are different things." She looked at him. "I chose the comfortable knowledge, the manageable version of it, the version in which my friend was dealing with a difficult financial and marital situation, not the version in which she was in danger. The manageable version is the version most people choose," Poirot said. "It requires less from us." "She didn't choose the manageable version," Ruth said. She made her list. She prepared her questions. She stood up to him. She paused. "And it killed her. Her courage was not the cause of her death," Poirot said quietly. "The cause of her death was a man who believed that he had the right to take what he wanted and the capacity to remove anything that threatened his access to it. Vera's courage, her decision to ask the questions, did not create that man. He was already that man. He would have been that man whether she asked the questions or not. Ruth looked at him. "She wasn't afraid," she said. "She told me that. On the phone. That afternoon. I'm not afraid of him, Ruth." And she wasn't. That was the truth of her. She wasn't afraid of him. She simply didn't know what he was capable of. Because people who are not capable of that specific thing cannot always recognize it in others. "No," Poirot said. "They cannot. That is the specific vulnerability of the honest person in the presence of someone who has made a different set of choices about what is permissible. The honest person cannot model the other's calculation because the calculation is outside their frame of reference." Ruth nodded. She set down her cup. She looked at the window where the November morning was coming, in grey and clean and without drama. "She would have handled this very well," she said. "The trial, the attention, all of it. Vera was good at the difficult public things. She was made of something solid." She paused. "I'll be there. At the trial. I'll give evidence. I'll say everything." "I know," Poirot said. He stayed for another half hour, which was the right amount of time, long enough that the visit had weight. Not so long that grief needed to be managed, rather than simply experienced. When he left, Ruth stood at her door and watched the street with the expression of someone beginning, slowly and carefully, to understand where they now stand. He took the train back from St. John's Wood to Baker Street, and then the Underground to Marylebone. And on both trains he sat very still with his Homburg on his knee and thought about the case with the reflective precision that these journeys allowed. He thought about the word "from," the third telling, the slip, if it was a slip, whether Geoffrey Alderton had said from the third time because it was the truth leaking through, or because his management of the story had become automatic enough that he had stopped monitoring it at the level of prepositions. The question of which it was mattered less than the fact that it happened, and that Poirot had been there to notice it, and that noticing it had opened the door to everything else. He thought about what kind of man Geoffrey Alderton was. Not a monster, this was important. The kind of person who did what Geoffrey had done was not a monster in the way that the word implied something recognizably different from ordinary humanity, something visibly other. Geoffrey Alderton was a man who had made a series of decisions that each seemed to him, at the time, manageable. The investment without authorization, manageable, potentially profitable, likely to be forgiven if it succeeded. The continued deception when Vera began to notice manageable, just a matter of time and reassurance. The dinner with Rosalind Fenn on Tuesday evenings, manageable. A business arrangement that had become personal, a thing that happened. And then, the night Vera asked her questions and the answers she required would have ended the manageability of everything. And Geoffrey Alderton had discovered, in that moment, that the capacity to find things manageable had become, in him, a capacity for something worse. That the quality that had allowed him to deceive and misappropriate and maintain appearances had a further application that he had perhaps always been capable of and had simply never needed to exercise before. This was the part of these cases that Poirot found most disturbing. Not the violence. Violence was shocking but comprehensible. The slide. The continuity between the small, manageable deceptions and the final, unmanageable act. The man who had taken his wife's money without permission and the man who had pushed her from a staircase were the same man, connected by the same refusal to accept the limits of what he was entitled to take. He thought about Vera's list of questions. Questions for G, written in her precise small hand, numbered, underlined where the anger showed through the precision. She had been entitled to those answers. She had prepared for them. She had not been afraid. He thought about Ruth Cavendish, saying, "She was made of something solid." Yes, Poirot thought, she was. The train moved through the grey November morning, and Poirot sat with his Homburg on his knee and thought about the solid and the soluble and the difference between them, and about the word "from," and about how much can be contained in a single substituted preposition when you are the kind of person who notices. He heard from Dre 6 weeks later. A letter, brief and precise in the solicitor's style. The trial date had been set for March. The forensic examination of the Newell Post cap had confirmed the compression mark as consistent with the grip of a person going over the banister. The phone records, the testimony of Ruth Cavendish and Rosalind Fenn, the financial documentation of the Marchmont fraud. Dre described the prosecution's case as strong. Rosalind Fenn had agreed to testify in exchange for a formal acknowledgement of her limited role and cooperation. She would lose her Marchmont interest. The planning appeal had been refused 2 months after the arrest, which meant the shares were worthless anyway, which gave her financial cooperation a practical simplicity that Dre described as convenient. She faced professional consequences but not criminal prosecution, which was, Dre acknowledged, imperfect justice but functional pragmatism. Poirot read the letter at his desk with his morning tisane and looked at the paragraph about the planning appeal with the specific attention it deserved. The shares were worthless. The thing that Geoffrey Alderton had decided his wife's life was worth the investment that would have been valuable if planning had been granted had been refused. The calculation on which everything rested had been wrong. He had killed Vera for a worthless stake in a refused development. This, Poirot thought, was not the most important moral fact of the case. The most important moral fact was that Vera Alderton had been alive and was now dead, and that the person who had made her dead was going to trial. The worthlessness of the financial motive was a separate thing, a bitter addendum, the specific irony of a crime built on a calculation that had failed on its own terms. He set down the letter. He thought about something Mrs. Hartwell had said in the garden case the previous autumn. The truth was there all along, waiting to be found. He had found it in a begonia pot. He had found this truth in a preposition, in the difference between two words that most people would never pause on, would let pass, would not hear at the specific level of their meaning. Tell me again how she died. That was what Poirot had asked Geoffrey Alderton 3 times in the drawing room of Alderton Hall. Not in those words, the words had been pleasant and circuitous and professionally courteous, but the request had been the same. Tell me again. Because the third time is where the slip lives. The third time, the story has become automatic enough that the monitoring relaxes, and the truth which is always there, waiting, finds the gap in the performance and comes through a single word. From. He put the letter in his file. He picked up his tisane. Outside, London was doing what London does in January grey, purposeful, full of its million lives and their million small deceptions and the much smaller number of serious ones. The street below moved. A bus, a woman with a shopping bag, 2 children, which he noted because children were rare in this street, and their presence was always a small addition to the morning. He sat in his ordered flat and thought, briefly, about Vera Alderton making her list of questions in her upper sitting room, the November light coming in from the east, the garden below going dormant. He thought about her telephone call to Ruth, the afternoon certainty in her voice. I'm not afraid of him. He hoped, wherever one goes with such certainty, she was still not afraid. Then he picked up his newspaper, because the work was done, and the morning was waiting, and the grey cells required, at intervals, the ordinary world to rest in before the next extraordinary thing arrived. It always arrived. It was, in Poirot's considered experience, one of the few constants of human life. The next case was always coming. He turned the page.